All right, now we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the various sources of bias that you might run into when collecting a sample and collecting data from the sample. Okay, so basically bias, you want to try to avoid it if at all possible, right? There's lots of things that can go wrong with samples. The text does give you a brief overview, and their examples are different from mine, so you might want to read them. So basically, sources of bias are found in samples that don't represent every individual in the population fairly. Please remember, samples will not measure every individual in the population. That is not a source of bias, okay? Samples will not measure everyone in the population. That is not a source of bias. Okay, that's just fact of life, okay? But and so if your sample is representative, we're going to be fine. But there's lots of things that can cause it to be not representative. Bad sampling techniques is one that we're going to talk about. This includes voluntary response samples and convenience samples. It also includes a bad sampling frame. So for instance, if I say, hey, I want to learn about all Clayton State students, but I only select from students in my stats classes, that means my sampling frame, the group of people I select my sample from, doesn't agree with the population I want to learn about. It doesn't, so my stats students are not going to represent all Clayton State students. Okay? We could have good technique in selecting our sample, but other biases might creep in. And we've talked about some of these. We've talked about a little bit about non-response and undercoverage, but there's other things like subjective wording. There's all these sources of bias, but we're just going to hit the big ones, okay? So voluntary response sample, what the heck is that, right? VRS. So in a voluntary response sample, respondents choose themselves, okay? This is, so there's not been an invitation to say, hey, Mary, will you complete my survey? I'm not going to call you. I'm not going to send you an email or a letter. I'm not going to go walk up to you in the mall, right? It's just, I put a sign up saying, you know, do my survey, and whoever walks by and decides to do it, they choose themselves. That's a voluntary response. Okay, no invitation has been issued specifically to the respondents. So like if you're watching, say, America's Got Talent or any of the other shows where you call in to vote for people, right? Who should win the show? You can call in to vote, right? That invitation, if you're watching the TV show, it's going out to everybody in the population, everybody who's watching the show, not to a specific subset of the population. And it's not to you personally, right? It's just saying, you know, hey, go grab your phone or vote online, whatever. You've got to make the effort. You've got to decide to do that. And you've not been invited to you specifically to do so. All right, so here the problem is going to be it's not representative. You know, this happens a lot where, you know, in any sort of these vote for me to be the best, you know, cat meme on Reddit or whatever the heck, right? Where they'll just people will recruit their friends and get their friends to recruit more friends to ask, you know, so this is not a random sample of the population, right? So it's not representative. It's not representative because it's only going to get people who feel strongly about whatever the survey is about. So it only, generally, not only, but primarily, say mostly those with, say, strong feelings will respond. Okay, So if I send an email to you saying, hey, please take this survey, is that a voluntary response sample or not? This one, no, because that email was sent to you specifically. You were selected to be in the survey. Now, whether or not you decide to respond to the survey, that's a different matter. But you were selected by somebody other than you. So this one is not a voluntary response. Okay, now if you visit a website and you see a link to a survey, it's there for everybody, and you decide to take the survey, that is voluntary response. You were not specifically selected to be in the sample. So keep that in mind when you go to ratemyprofessor.com or ratemyprofessors.com. And for the most part, that is a voluntary response sample. They've gotten better because once you register, I think they email you at the end of each semester saying, hey, rate this semester's professors that you had, right? But most of the people are just going there and saying, hey, I had a terrible professor, I want to vent about them, right? So you really need to take what they have with a grain of salt, because it primarily is a voluntary response sample. And a lot of the samples there either are people who love the professor or people who had a really bad experience with the professor. So we have a lot of strong opinions. And the hate ones, hated the professor, tend to be the louder ones, right? Okay. So we already talked about why. You do want to use common sense with these, right? There's a lot of issues that can impact the validity of your data, and we are not going to cover them all in these videos. You do want to read the chapter. You want to use common sense, your critical thinking skills, but don't overthink, okay? In the real world, as a researcher, you want to try to take the measurements yourself. You don't want to have students self-report them or subjects self-report them, because a lot of times they're not going to be truthful. As an example, do you think my actual weight matches what's on my driver's license? Yeah, probably not. I think it's maybe only 10 pounds off, but still, right? Because I self-reported and I don't want to admit what my actual weight is. Right? You want to pay attention to sample sizes. Small samples can be okay in some situations, especially if the population is small. But a sample of 3, 4, or 5 is pretty much never going to be any good. Okay? So samples of about 30 or bigger are usually going to be okay. So sample size, at least 30, we'll say generally okay. And we'll cover a lot more on sample size requirements in the later chapters when we talk about inference. But just know, your sample does not have to be huge. You don't have to have 1,000 people in it. 100 might be fine. 50 might be fine. 30 often will be fine, okay? 10, not so much, okay? Getting really small. 3 or 4 people is going to have too much variability, too much variation from one person to the next to make a good sample. Okay, so we're going to take a break and talk about the rest of this in the next video.